Hello everyone, and welcome to Voices Behind Reddit. Here we bring you the best stories from Reddit where real experiences and captivating tales come to life. Let's get started.
Falsely accused of stealing my sister's engagement ring. My family kicked me out, then realized their mistake. Imagine coming home one day, only to be met with accusing eyes and pointed fingers, all directed at you by the people you trust most. That's exactly what happened to Oliver. Oliver thought he knew his family. They'd been there for him through ups and downs, but nothing prepared him for the day he was labeled a thief by his own sister Clara. She was convinced he'd stolen something precious to her, her engagement ring. It wasn't just any ring. It was a symbol of her love, her future. And in a heartbeat, Clara pointed the finger at Oliver without even a second thought. It wasn't just the accusation that hurt him. It was that his parents, the people who had always supported him, took her side without hesitation. Oliver tried to explain, over and over, that he didn't take it, that he would never do something like that to his own sister. But they weren't listening. Instead, they demanded he confess. His own family was pressuring him, as if his word, his innocence, didn't matter. Every plea he made was met with cold stares and dismissive words. They weren't looking for the truth. They just wanted someone to blame, and to them, Oliver fit the bill. Then came the ultimatum. With a coldness he'd never seen from them before, his parents gave him one choice: admit to the crime or leave. They weren't giving him time to explain, no chance to make them understand. In their eyes, he was already guilty. So he left. Just like that, Oliver was out the door, out of the life he'd always known, left to face the world on his own, all because of something he didn't do. And as he walked away from the only home he'd ever known, the betrayal cut deep, leaving scars he would carry for years to come. False accusation and family betrayal. Oliver remembers the day clearly. It started off like any other, but things took a sudden dark turn when his sister Clara burst into the room, her face flushed with anger and accusation. She was certain that her engagement ring had gone missing, and without a pause, she declared that Oliver must have taken it. Just like that. No evidence. No proof. Just an accusation that hit him like a punch to the gut. At first, Oliver was shocked. This was his sister, someone he'd known his whole life. He couldn't understand how she could believe he'd do something like that. He hadn't taken anything, let alone something as precious as her engagement ring. He tried to explain, but she wouldn't hear it. Her mind was made up, and in her eyes, he was guilty. Things quickly spiraled from there. His parents got involved, and much to Oliver's disbelief, they sided with Clara without even listening to his side. They didn't ask questions, didn't pause to consider that maybe he was telling the truth. Instead, they demanded answers from him. Answers he didn't have because he was innocent. In those moments, he felt a coldness from them he'd never felt before. It was like they didn't see him as their son anymore, but as someone who'd crossed a line, someone they couldn't trust. The look in their eyes was harsh and unforgiving. And no matter how many times he swore he hadn't taken the ring, it didn't seem to matter. They only grew angrier. Days went by, each one worse than the last. His family kept pressuring him, pushing him to just admit it. They told him it would be easier if he'd just confess and take responsibility. But how could he confess to something he didn't do? How could he look his family in the eyes and lie just to make things right? It was a nightmare. He'd come home hoping to find support, hoping they'd believe him. But instead, he felt like an outsider in his own home. His pleas fell on deaf ears, and with every word, he could feel his parents' trust slipping further away. It hurt. It hurt more than he could put into words. And then came the final blow. His parents gave him an ultimatum. Either he'd come clean about taking the ring, or he'd have to leave. They didn't even seem sad about it. They just wanted him gone. With a heavy heart and no other choice, Oliver packed his things and walked out the door. As he closed it behind him, he knew things would never be the same. The family he'd always leaned on had turned their backs on him, and for the first time in his life, he was completely, heartbreakingly alone. Homelessness and rebuilding a new life. When Oliver stepped out of his family's home that day, he had nothing but a small bag and a heart full of hurt. He didn't have anywhere to go. No money saved up, and no idea of what would come next. All he knew was that he couldn't go back. Those first nights were the hardest. He'd sleep in parks, on benches, wherever he could find a place to rest his head. The cold air and loneliness cut deep. Every sound, every shadow made him uneasy. He was used to having a roof over his head, a warm bed, and the comfort of family. Now, he had none of that. But he didn't let himself fall apart. He had no choice but to keep going. He knew he had to find a way to survive, to stand on his own. So he started looking for work, any job that would take him. At first, he took whatever he could find. Small jobs like cleaning, lifting boxes, running errands. The pay was barely enough to scrape by, but it was something. Days turned into weeks, and eventually, Oliver managed to find a more stable job at a local diner. The hours were long, and the work was tough, but he showed up every day, determined to make it work. His boss noticed his hard work and reliability, and for the first time in months, Oliver felt a small sense of security. With his first few paychecks, he found a tiny, run-down room he could rent. It wasn't much, just 4 walls and a bed, but it was a place to call his own. Each night he'd come back exhausted, his body aching from hours on his feet. But he was grateful to have a place, even if it was far from the home he'd known. As he settled into his new life, he also started meeting new people, colleagues from work, regulars at the diner who would chat with him, even a few neighbors. Slowly, he built a new support system, a small circle of people who cared. They weren't family, but they became friends who would check on him, share a meal, and lend a helping hand when he needed it. For the first time, Oliver began to feel that he could make it on his own. He learned how to rely on himself, how to keep going even when things got tough. The betrayal from his family was still there, a heavy weight he carried every day, but he didn't let it hold him back. He used it as fuel, something to push him forward. Day by day, he grew stronger, more independent, and more determined to build a life he could be proud of. Truth revealed. 3 years passed. By now, Oliver had settled into his new life. He still carried the hurt from his family's betrayal, but he was doing okay. He had a steady job, a small circle of friends who felt like family, and he'd worked hard to build himself back up. He'd managed to push thoughts of that awful day to the back of his mind, though the scars were still there. Then, one day, out of nowhere, he got a call from his mom. He hadn't heard from her in years, so seeing her number pop up on his screen brought all the memories rushing back. He hesitated, his heart pounding, unsure if he even wanted to answer. But curiosity got the better of him, and he picked up. Her voice was shaky, full of a mix of relief and sadness. She explained that they'd finally found Clara's ring. It was right there, jammed inside the garbage disposal in the kitchen. The same house where they'd accused him, the same place they'd thrown him out of. All this time, the ring had been sitting there hidden away, while they turned their backs on him. His mom sounded apologetic, even a little embarrassed. She tried to explain how sorry they all were, how they'd made a huge mistake, how they'd let their anger and judgment cloud their thinking. She asked him to come home, said they wanted to make things right. She even mentioned that Clara wanted to apologize, that she felt terrible for accusing him. But as Oliver listened, he didn't feel relief or joy. He felt empty. They were just words now. Words that came way too late, after he'd spent years struggling on his own. He'd lost so much, his trust in them, his sense of family, even his own peace of mind. And now, after all that time, after all he'd been through, a simple sorry didn't seem to hold much weight. He hung up the phone, not angry but just tired. He knew that forgiveness wasn't something he could just hand over. It would take time, if he even wanted to go down that road. His family's apology felt like a small crack in a wall of betrayal that had taken years to build. Part of him wanted to forget the past, to leave that part of his life behind. But another part of him felt that maybe, just maybe, he owed it to himself to face his family again, if only to find a bit of closure. Initial steps toward reconciliation. After that call, Oliver didn't rush to reconnect with his family. The apology was there, but the hurt ran deep, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to face them. He'd spent years picking up the pieces of his life, building something stable from the ground up. A few words of regret weren't going to make everything right. But the thought lingered. Could he really just ignore them forever? Could he walk away completely? Or would that only leave a part of him stuck in the past? He decided he needed some clarity, so he started going to therapy, hoping it would help him work through everything he'd been carrying around. He wasn't there to forgive his family right away. He just wanted to understand his own feelings and make peace with what had happened. Through therapy, he found ways to process the betrayal, to make sense of the anger and sadness that had followed him like a shadow. He learned that setting boundaries was okay, that he didn't have to rush to forgive, and that his feelings were valid. Bit by bit, he started to see things more clearly. When he finally reached out to his family, he did it on his terms. He agreed to meet, but only if they respected the boundaries he'd set. He wanted to hear them out, but he also knew he needed to protect himself. The old trust was gone, and he wasn't about to let them in easily again. They'd have to earn that back, and he wanted them to know it wouldn't happen overnight. The meeting was tense but honest. His family apologized again, more genuinely this time, admitting how much they'd let him down. They listened as he shared his side of things, his years of pain and loneliness, the hardships he faced on his own. It wasn't easy to relive those memories, but he felt a weight lift as he spoke his truth. While there was no magical moment of forgiveness, something shifted that day. The walls weren't completely down, but maybe, just maybe, they had started to crack a little. And for the first time, Oliver felt that he had some control, that he could decide how much of his family he wanted in his life. It wouldn't be like before, but maybe that was okay. This time, he would set the pace and choose what was right for him, prioritizing personal growth and moving forward. After that first meeting, Oliver felt a sense of closure, but he knew that reconnecting with his family wouldn't be his main focus. He had spent years building a life that he could finally feel proud of, a life where he'd worked hard for every bit of peace he now had. And while there was a part of him that was open to letting his family back in, he knew he had to put himself first. He went back to his job and threw himself into his work, putting in extra hours and saving up every bit he could. He'd started to dream bigger, thinking about ways to improve his future. Over time, he decided to enroll in night classes to keep learning and open up more opportunities. Each small step felt like he was moving forward, building something stable that he could truly rely on. His friends, the ones he'd met during his hardest times, became even more like family. They'd been there when he had no one, and they were there now, cheering him on with every step he took. With them, he found a support system that was honest, solid, and real. They'd seen him at his lowest and celebrated his progress without judgment. Months turned into years, and eventually, Oliver decided it was time for a fresh start. He moved to a new city, one that felt full of possibilities. He didn't cut off his family entirely. He'd kept in touch, but he was clear about his boundaries. They'd check in occasionally, and he'd visit once in a while, but he didn't let them too close. He knew he had to protect the life he'd built, the peace he'd fought so hard to find. In the end, Oliver found that he didn't need things to go back to how they were. He'd moved on, not just from the betrayal, but from the idea that he needed their full acceptance to feel whole. He'd created his own path, his own family and his friends, and his own peace, and that was enough.